I have been tracking global financial warfare for years, and I have never seen anything quite like what just happened in Venezuela. When US forces captured Nicolas Maduro on January 3, 2026, most people thought they were watching another regime change operation. Another story about democracy, another story about drugs, another story about restoring order. They are missing the real story. This was not about cocaine. It was not about human rights. It was not even about Venezuela. This was about the survival of the dollar system itself. And here is the part that should make everyone in Washington extremely uncomfortable. It may have already failed. The United States does not deploy the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, 15,000 troops, and a dozen warships to the Caribbean because of fentanyl. That explanation does not survive even 5 minutes of serious scrutiny. According to Venezuela's own ambassador to Turkey, Venezuela does not even play a meaningful role in global drug trafficking. The math does not work. The risk does not match the excuse. So what was the real target? Proof. Proof that the dollar system is optional. Let me explain why that is more dangerous to American power than any missile. For more than 50 years, the global financial system has been built on a single invisible rule. If you want energy, you must first obtain dollars. That rule was created in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window and the United States cut a historic deal with Saudi Arabia. Oil would be priced in dollars. Oil producers would recycle those dollars into US Treasury bonds. And in exchange, the United States would provide military protection. That system created artificial global demand for dollars. It worked so well that most people stopped seeing it. But systems that are invisible are also fragile. And Venezuela just proved that you can run a full-scale energy economy without touching the dollar at all. Since 2018, Venezuela has sold 100% of its oil exports to China. Every single barrel, every single contract, settled in yuan, not dollars. We are talking about roughly 600,000 barrels per day flowing into China completely outside the SWIFT banking system that Washington controls. That is not symbolic. That is structural. That is about 4% of China's total oil imports conducted entirely outside the dollar system. And it gets more disturbing. When sanctions cut Venezuela off from traditional banking channels, they did not collapse. They adapted. PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, now demands payment in Tether cryptocurrency under what Maduro called the anti-blockade law. They created a sanctions-proof payment rail using a dollar-linked digital asset that operates outside American control. Think about how insane that is. A country sanctioned by the United States is now selling oil using a digital dollar system that Washington does not control. That alone should tell you something is broken. But the story goes much deeper. China did not start this in 2025. They started in 2007. Through the Loans for Oil program, Beijing injected more than $60 billion into Venezuela. But they did not want repayment in money. They wanted barrels. Venezuela paid for railways, satellites, and infrastructure not with currency, but with crude oil. The Tinoco-Anaco Railway, the Simon Bolivar Satellite System, enhanced oil recovery projects, all funded by physical energy, not paper claims. China was building a parallel system while Washington was still arguing about sanctions. Now look at the strategic map. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That is more than Saudi Arabia. More than 6 times what the United States has. And yet they are producing only about 1 million barrels per day. Less than 1% of global production. This is not a technical limitation. This is a strategic choice. With proper investment, Venezuela could easily reach 2.5 to 3 million barrels per day again. That is spare capacity larger than most OPEC members. And crucially, most of that oil sits in the Orinoco Belt, a massive heavy crude region similar to Canada's oil sands. Here is why that matters. Most U.S. Gulf Coast refineries were specifically designed to process this type of heavy crude. Venezuelan oil is perfect for producing diesel, asphalt, and industrial fuels. In many cases, U.S. refineries are more efficient processing Venezuelan oil than their own domestic light crude. So the United States is structurally dependent on the exact country it has been trying to strangle. Now look at what happened in November 2025. China issued $4 billion in US dollar-denominated bonds. They received $118 billion in orders, 30 times oversubscribed. Investors were fighting each other to buy Chinese government debt. But here is the part that made every Treasury official panic. Those bonds began trading at lower yields than US Treasuries. Read that again. Global investors were willing to accept lower returns on Chinese debt than on American debt. That does not happen in a healthy dollar system. That is the market quietly voting. And while that was happening, Venezuela became an official BRICS Plus partner. They gained access to China's cross-border interbank payment system. In 2024 alone, that system processed 175 billion yuan in transactions, equivalent to $24.5 trillion. It connects nearly 5,000 banks across 150 countries. Venezuela now has financing, payment rails, and diplomatic protection from the world's second-largest economy. And China is not just buying oil. They are buying the future. Chinese state companies have been quietly taking equity stakes in Venezuelan production capacity. They are not betting on Maduro. They are betting on geology. They know that whoever controls physical energy controls the real economy. Which brings us back to January 3, 2026. When you need aircraft carriers and special forces to stop an oil producer from selling in yuan, you are no longer defending a system. You are enforcing a collapsing one. And that is why this intervention is not a sign of strength. It is a confession of weakness. To understand why Washington panicked, you have to understand how fragile the U.S. debt machine has become. The American government is no longer financing itself the way a normal country does. It is rolling debt, constantly. In 2026 alone, the United States must refinance more than $8 trillion of existing obligations. That is not new spending. That is just keeping the lights on. At the same time, annual deficits are approaching $2 trillion, and interest payments have crossed the $1 trillion mark. Let that sink in. The United States now spends more on interest than on national defense. This system only works under one condition. There must always be buyers for U.S. Treasury bonds. Not just some buyers, constant, massive, reliable buyers. For decades, those buyers were easy to find. Oil producers recycled petrodollars into treasuries. Export nations parked reserves in U.S. debt. Central banks treated treasuries as risk-free collateral. But that world is quietly disappearing. China's treasury holdings fell to $759 billion in December 2025. That is the 9th consecutive monthly decline and the lowest level since 2009. Japan, the largest foreign holder, has also begun reducing exposure. The United Kingdom dumped more than $80 billion in U.S. government debt in a single month. At the same time, central banks in emerging markets bought more than 630 tons of gold in the first 9 months of 2025 alone. That is the fastest accumulation pace since the 1960s. This is not symbolism. This is capital repositioning. This is what it looks like when trust leaves the system quietly. Now, here is the dangerous feedback loop. Every successful example of dollar bypass accelerates the next one. Venezuela proves you can sell oil in yuan. China proves its bonds can trade better than U.S. debt. BRICS proves there is a growing settlement network outside SWIFT. Suddenly, holding massive dollar reserves stops looking prudent and starts looking risky, and the math turns brutal very quickly. If fewer buyers show up at treasury auctions, yields must rise. When yields rise, interest costs explode. When interest costs explode, deficits widen. When deficits widen, more bonds must be issued, which pushes yields up again. This is a classic sovereign debt spiral. And the only thing that has prevented it so far is global faith in the dollar system itself. Faith, not fundamentals. That is why Venezuela is so dangerous to Washington. It is not just one country. It is a demonstration, a working prototype of post-dollar energy trade. And once a prototype exists, others copy it. Brazil already conducts between 25 and 30% of its trade with China in local currencies. Argentina continues repaying IMF obligations in yuan. Russia sells energy to China in rubles and yuan. Saudi Arabia has openly discussed pricing some oil sales in non-dollar currencies. Every one of these moves would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Now they are becoming normal. And that is where the bond market comes in. When Chinese government bonds trade at lower yields than US Treasuries, that is not a headline. That is a verdict. It means global capital is starting to treat American debt as riskier than Chinese debt. That is a psychological regime shift. And psychology is everything in finance. This is why oil prices falling in 2025 did not strengthen the dollar. Normally, cheaper energy supports the US currency. This time, West Texas crude fell nearly 20%, and the dollar still weakened. Because this crisis is not about commodities. It is about architecture, the architecture of global money. Now look at the desperation signal. When you need to use military force to prevent a country from selling oil in a different currency, you are no longer running a financial system. You are running a protection racket. That changes everything. It tells every country watching that the dollar is no longer a neutral medium. It is a weapon. And weapons eventually provoke countermeasures. But here is the real strategic pivot that almost nobody noticed. Trump announced that American oil companies will invest billions to rebuild Venezuela's oil infrastructure. Read that carefully. The United States is no longer trying to control the system. It is trying to control the barrels. That is a return to 19th century geopolitics, from financial hegemony to resource control. Chevron is currently exporting about 140,000 barrels per day from Venezuela. But Washington is talking about bringing back ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and others. Rebuilding Venezuelan production to 3 million barrels per day would require between $80 and $90 billion and 5 to 7 years. This is not fast, this is not cheap, and China is not waiting. Beijing just announced a zero-tariff trade agreement with Venezuela covering 400 product categories. While Washington sends troops, China signs contracts. Two very different strategies. Now, zoom out. BRICS is expanding. Indonesia became the 10th full member in 2025. 13 more countries joined as partners. Together, they represent more than a quarter of the global economy and nearly half the world ES population. They are not talking about de-dollarization anymore. They are building the plumbing, payment systems, settlement networks, development banks, currency swap lines. This is slow, quiet, and unstoppable. Which brings us to the truly uncomfortable question. Can the United States maintain financial dominance using military power alone? History suggests no. Empires that try to enforce monetary systems by force usually accelerate their own decline, because they destroy the very trust that made their system attractive. And once trust is gone, no number of aircraft carriers can bring it back. Once a system shows cracks, history tells us something very simple. Others start pushing. Venezuela is not the end of this story. It is the beginning. Every country in Latin America is now watching this episode very carefully, not because they like instability, but because they are studying incentives. Brazil already conducts between 25 and 30% of its trade with China in local currencies. Argentina continues repaying IMF obligations in yuan even after political changes. Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia are all resource-rich countries with growing Chinese financing. They are all asking the same question. Why should we remain locked into a financial system that can be weaponized against us at any moment? That is how monetary blocks are born. Not through ideology. Through fear and risk management. The Monroe Doctrine mindset, updated for the 21st century, essentially tells every country in the Western Hemisphere the same thing. Choose. Either stay inside the U.S. financial orbit or face political and economic pressure. That may sound like strength. In reality, it is how influence decays, because it turns cooperation into compliance and partnership into vulnerability. China's approach is the opposite. It does not ask countries to abandon the dollar. It offers them alternatives: settlement in yuan, development financing, infrastructure investment, payment systems that do not run through Washington. That is a much more attractive proposition in a world that is already nervous about sanctions, tariffs, and political unpredictability. This is why BRICS expansion matters more than most people realize. This is not a club, it is an ecosystem. An ecosystem designed to function even if access to Western financial infrastructure is restricted. Every new member increases its credibility. Every successful transaction outside the dollar increases its momentum. And momentum in financial systems is incredibly hard to reverse. Now let us talk about what this means for ordinary people. Because monetary transitions are not abstract, they always show up in three places first: prices, jobs, savings. When a reserve currency system weakens, import prices rise. Financing becomes more expensive. Governments face pressure to inflate away debt. That means higher cost of living and more fragile growth. This does not happen overnight. It happens slowly, then suddenly. This is why central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace since the 1960s. They are not doing it because they like shiny metal. They are doing it because they do not trust the stability of the current monetary order. Gold is not an investment. It is an insurance policy. Now look at the psychological shift. For decades, holding dollars and US Treasuries was considered the safest position in the world. Now we are seeing Chinese bonds occasionally trade at lower yields. That is a warning light. Not because China is perfect, but because capital is diversifying away from a single anchor. And once that diversification starts, it tends to accelerate. Now, let us return to Venezuela. The real danger is not that Venezuela itself matters. It is that Venezuela proves the template works. Energy outside the dollar, financing outside Western banks, settlement outside SWIFT, political survival despite sanctions. That is a proof of concept. And proof of concept is how systems spread. This is exactly what scares Washington. Not the loss of one country, the loss of the monopoly. Because the dollar system is not just about trade. It is about financing U.S. deficits. It is about keeping borrowing costs low. It is about sustaining a lifestyle that depends on cheap external capital. When that privilege erodes, the adjustment is painful. No empire transitions gently out of monetary dominance. Now, here is the final, uncomfortable question. What happens when China decides to retaliate for the Venezuela intervention by accelerating its own de-dollarization push? Not with speeches, with policy. More yuan settlement, more bond issuance, more commodity contracts priced outside dollars, more bilateral swap lines. That would not crash the system. It would hollow it out. And hollowing out is far more dangerous than collapse, because it gives the illusion of stability right up until the moment it is gone. The dollar will not disappear, but it will become one currency among several. And that is a completely different world. In that world, the United States cannot fund itself as easily, cannot sanction as freely, cannot dictate terms as cheaply. Power becomes more expensive, and politics becomes more constrained by reality. This is the real meaning of the Venezuela crisis. It is not about Maduro. It is not about oil. It is about the moment the world starts seriously preparing for life after monetary unipolarity. And that process, once it begins, rarely goes backward. The intervention in Venezuela may delay that future, but it also made one thing clear to everyone watching. The system is no longer self-sustaining. It needs force to survive, and that is always the sign of something approaching the end of its era.